There is a war underway. We need to fight for democracy. The way in which Biden Harris ran the campaign, the way in which Keir Starmer is currently doing things, this is also not going to work. And that's part of the problem.
Welcome back to The Tea, the show where we dive into the stories behind the headlines. I'm your host, Myriam Francois. 2024 saw the most far-right parties elected in recent elections across Europe and indeed within the European Parliament itself. Far-right movements are surging across the world, from winning elections in Germany and Austria to President Trump's recent comeback. In just a few weeks, he's pardoned over 1,500 people convicted in the January 6th attack on Capitol Hill. He's done away with DEI programs, threatened tariffs to Mexico, China, and Canada, and laid the groundwork for mass deportations, including in Gaza. Our democracies are in crisis, and few seem to understand why. But is fascism just rising, or has it always been a feature of our societies? What do billionaires like Elon Musk and Zuckerberg have to gain from aligning themselves with this movement? And what exactly is at stake as the far right continues to make electoral strides? To break it all down, I'm joined by Dr. Nafeez Ahmed, an award-winning investigative journalist, author, and systems theorist. His reporting has taken down far-right networks, exposed corruption, and forced resignations at the highest levels. His new book, Alt-Reich, The Network War to Destroy the West from Within, digs deep into how this movement really works. He has predicted some of the biggest political and economic shocks of the past 2 decades, including the 2008 financial crisis. Now, before we get into it, can I ask you to do one thing to support the show? Hit that subscribe button now and sign up to our Patreon. Details are in the caption below. Thank you. Welcome to The Tea, Nafeez.
Thanks, Myriam.
Thanks for coming on. First of all, for those who are not familiar with you and your work, can I just ask you to tell us a little bit about yourself and how it is that you've come to do the work that you do today?
As a young British Muslim, I wanted to understand things like terrorism, things like extremism. I wanted to understand some of the big conflicts that were affecting many parts of the Muslim world. So I got very interested in the study of conflict and what drives conflicts. Ended up doing a PhD on the colonial systems and how different colonial systems can lead to different types of violence and genocidal violence. And that led me down to a rabbit hole of trying to understand systems and how they work. And one of the things I was really intrigued by and alarmed by was this pattern that you keep seeing in history where systemic breakdown and crisis drives people to kind of the fringes and can lead to mass violence and kind of otherizing different groups.
And why the far right? What sort of sparked your interest in looking deeper at these movements?
Growing up, as a young British Muslim, I'm ethnically Bangladeshi. Getting called a Paki in the street now and again and having people make jokes about curry and just weird, people smelling like curry and stuff like that was just normal, right? That was just like the par for the course. My wife, she experienced a lot of really hardcore racism growing up. Her parents and her family were often targeted by like literal Combat 18 thugs.
Oh my God.
And it was really insane.
For people who don't know who Combat 18 are, can you just give a sense of what this
is? Again, Combat 18 obviously doesn't exist anymore, thank God, but it was a military kind of paramilitary wing of the BNP, the British National Party, which was obviously the neo-Nazi party set up decades ago now. And Combat 18 was kind of their we're going to fight on the streets kind of movement thing. So they would literally go around harassing brown people, black people on the streets of London. Just looking at what happened last year with the riots in the summer, that really felt like, what the hell is going on? Like,
Indeed.
We thought we were past this. This was like more than 20 years ago. 20, 30 years ago, we had stuff like that going on in the streets of London. And to see that again, to see, group gangs of white supremacists running around the streets, kind of literally targeting people of color, and trying to set fire to, these buildings where their asylum seekers are staying, was actually terrifying. And made you kind of think, where is this going? what is going on? Is this now the taste of things to come? Like, what the hell's happening?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I feel like exactly what you were saying. This summer was a real wake-up call for many people that, there had been signs that the far right was on the up. The influence of far-right ideology, I think, is more and more palpable in the mainstream. What distinguishes your analysis from others is that you're not suggesting that this is sort of the emergence of a far-right, a new far right, but actually that there's a level of continuity with the Nazi ideology that obviously led to the Holocaust, but also, has been the underpinning of many currents of thought that are still alive in Europe and the world today, the Western world in particular, I should say. So can you just outline your analysis and how you came to this conclusion?
From the time of the Nazis in the 1930s, there was a deliberate effort to, after the Second World War, to actually rehabilitate Nazi ideology in a new post-Nazi context.
By whom?
By Nazi sympathizers and white supremacists, many of whom at the time had actual close connections to the Nazis. So much of the story revolves around an obscure foundation called the Pioneer Fund. It was set up in New York in the 1930s by a textiles magnate in America. And these guys were open Nazi sympathizers. They were actually in touch with Nazis in Germany, even before they came to power. There was a lot of kind of cross-fertilization of ideas between American eugenicists and Nazi German eugenicists. And they were inspiring each other, in fact. And, a lot of the German eugenicists were looking at what the Americans were doing on immigration, on kind of sterilization laws, all of this stuff which was targeted against black people, and also openly at that time targeted against Jews. They were looking at that and saying, we should do stuff like that here in Nazi Germany. That's really inspirational. We should do that. And so they brought those in. And then when they actually got into government and they started implementing these things on an industrial scale, that was massive inspiration for the American eugenicists. And they were like, wow, that's amazing. Let's import that to the United States. So they actually began attempting to move legislation in the US inspired by Nazi Germany. So it was this very terrifying kind of vicious cycle that was taking place there, a cycle of radicalization. But of course, after the Second World War, it wasn't fashionable to be a Nazi. Like, you couldn't go around being like, hey, I'm a Nazi. You'd get punched in the face or something. Like,
well, particularly because, of course, the US presents itself as the liberator of Europe from the grips of Nazism.
Absolutely.
Right? I mean,
so
that's the narrative.
Yeah, they just won the war. So it didn't make sense. So these guys went kind of underground on the very pro-Nazi stuff. What they then tried to do is literally reframe themselves as, we hate Nazis. We're against Nazis. So you had actual Nazis who didn't like Jews, didn't like black people, didn't like anyone. And they were coming around saying, actually, we're not Nazi, we hate Nazis. So the whole kind of narrative started to shift. And what they did is they focused on new things. So they started to really double down, not on things like anti-Semitism, because they knew that wouldn't have traction. Instead, they were focusing on like the civil rights movement. They really doubled down on anti-black activism. Mm-hmm. And you can see how they began to actually move into these spaces with a lot of success. So the Pioneer Fund was actually financing a lot of these anti-civil rights movements and working with senior Republican politicians. And that's what I think is really astonishing about the book, is it takes that stuff that happened then and it shows how this kind of lobby or group, this nexus around the Pioneer Fund, managed to infiltrate and subvert mainstream conservative thinking right from the get-go. Working with groups like the Heritage Foundation, they're one of the largest conservative think tanks in America. They've influenced every Republican government for decades.
And they're still going today.
And massively influential right now in the Trump administration and all of the mad executive orders that Trump is pushing through. A lot of this has already been written in this Project 2025 plan that was hatched before Trump came in. And Heritage Foundation were the people behind that, who coordinated lots of different experts and right-wing kind of thinkers across the landscape, across like 100-odd conservative institutions. And I think that's what people don't realize. And it didn't stop there. It was all over the world. I mean, even the Institute for Economic Affairs, which is obviously a very well-known right-wing think tank in the UK, was very responsible, kind of the Thatcherite kind of free market policies. These guys have also been influenced by this kind of thinking.
So when you say influence, just for people who are watching this, who are thinking this all sounds a little conspiracy theorists, who are very skeptical, what exactly do you mean by they influenced mainstream think tanks, both in the US and the UK?
So what I do in the book is I actually trace the activities of particular individuals and how they intersect with all these networks and just tell the story.
Yeah.
And it's entirely up to people to make up their own mind about what they think. But it's really astonishing. So we go back to around the 1970s when the Heritage Foundation was set up, right? At that time, they actually were already influenced by the Pioneer Fund. So Ed Fuellner, who was one of the co-founders, he recruits this guy called Roger Pearson. Roger Pearson was already working with the Nazi-aligned Pioneer Fund. They had been funding eugenics research in different universities in America.
And just for those who don't know, eugenics research is research that kind of seeks to confirm the notion that there are biological determinants to hierarchies of humans. Right? There are more or less advanced humans. This is pure Nazi ideology, and that you can find a scientific basis for that. Sorry.
That's right, and this is pretty important because what was happening in these decades is that the strategy was to launder Nazi ideology into the mainstream under the semblance of science, but to kind of remove the Nazi origins from that. And the book that really encapsulates how clever they were in doing this is called The Bell Curve. It's by a guy called Charles Murray, who is kind of American social scientist, seemed to be very distinguished and all the rest of it. But he put together this book. All of the research was basically from kind of stuff that was funded by the Pioneer Fund, like all of this stuff. And what he said is that he believes that the reason that there are massive inequalities in society is not because there's anything to do with society and system and policy. It's all because there are largely genetically determined inequalities in IQ, so in the intelligence. So biology has created and genetics creates this kind of hierarchy in society. Black people are at the bottom, white people are at the top. There's debates amongst them about which other people might be in between, but that's what they all agree on.
How original. Yes. So just very briefly, because I think what might be confusing is the idea that this fund, so the Pioneer Fund that exists in the US from the 1930s, right? They are aligned with Nazi Germany, which of course begins to rise in the 1930s and then comes to power in 1939 when Hitler's elected, and of course then takes over Europe, including parts of France. And Europe is in the grips of Nazism, which has as its main focus, Jewish people, Romani people, disabled people, communists, anyone who opposes, gay people, of course, who also oppose Nazism. We kind of understand Nazism's focus on these people. But are you saying that the target of Nazi I suppose, violence and Nazi eradication policies was not fixed? Because does it then change? They get to the US and they're like, okay, Nazism out of fashion now, can't be an open Nazi anymore. Let's just switch it up. It just seems a little odd to me that they can just switch their focus. Like, how does that happen?
So what's interesting is you go back to even the evolution of Nazi ideology, that gives us a sense of how it worked, right? Because they didn't come out straight away and say, that's the final solution, let's do it. That was a radicalization process. What they started off with were these general ideas that there's inferior populations and there's superior populations. That was the grounding. And obviously, this is not that new. We've had this during colonization. There were these ideas, and there was some of them were linked to social Darwinism and these the distortion of Darwinist theories of evolution, saying that actually these are just biological hierarchies. Some people are just better than others, and it's biology. So that was kind of the origin of these ways of thinking. And under the Nazis, this began to be kind of solidified and cemented. So the Nazis really pioneered this kind of eugenics research, which looked at, well, if there are these biological hierarchies, but we need to kind of, in order to have survival of civilization, we have to take control of this. So that's what it was all about. It was like, you need to have a political program that engineers societies in such a way that the fittest rise to the top, and the ones who are a problem, you get rid of them. And that was where it began to be, well, who are those ones who are problems? Oh, well, they're disabled people. They're obviously not going to be great for society.
Wow.
Roma. And so, that's why the Nazi Holocaust targeted a wide range of groups. But obviously the Jewish people were particularly targeted and were seen as there was this anti-Semitic ideology that Adolf Hitler drew on and really kind of gravitated toward, and said, these people are fundamentally parasitical. They're the biggest problem. Okay. And eventually it was like, as they were planning things and doing things, what started off as a containment deportation policy rapidly became, that's not working.
An extermination
policy.
So what you're saying is that Nazism is basically driven by the idea of a hierarchy of human value, and the idea that actually they believe that they serve society best by eradicating these sort of weaker strands of the human race, God forbid, and that whilst in the Second World War, the focus of that was the Jewish people predominantly, but also Roma people, gay people, etc., that today that focus has shifted to some extent, but the underlying principles are the same. Would that be a fair?
That's right. I think you found that what we found is that people like Charles Murray bought into the general ideology.
So who's Charles Murray?
Charles Murray, this American social scientist. He got a massive fund from this major conservative foundation, the Bradley Foundation, which gets most of its money from industrial automation, actually. And these guys are one of the biggest funders of conservative groups in America. So they gave him, I think, up to $1 million over several years. He wrote this book. He took all of this scientific racism that the Pioneer Fund was essentially bankrolling to kind of do more research. They were doing all sorts of very, very weird research, like blood studies and all this kind of stuff. Put it together and kind of repackaged it into this conclusion that there are these, science says that there are these biological hierarchies, and black people are basically inferior to white people. They're intellectually, cognitively inferior. They have lower IQ. There's nothing we can do about this. What does that mean politically and economically? Well, we should not have a welfare state, because why would you put money into groups of people that are inherently unproductive and stupid?
Wow.
So you need to do other things. Control the birth rate, contain the population, obviously have massive immigration controls. So what was interesting is that this was really attractive to neoclassical and neoliberal economists. Those are basically the economists who became very big around kind of Thatcher and Reagan era, who were basically saying, we need total freedom of movement for capital. Right, for people with huge amounts of money should not be constrained in what they do by government policy. They should be able to pretty much invest where they like, go across borders, do what they want. So massive deregulation. Private economic power should be able to do pretty much what it wants, but you contain populations in that way. So that was very attractive it made a lot of sense to people. So when Charles Murray was then going around speaking about his ideas, he didn't go around saying, he wrote this book and he said, look, there are these structures and this means we need to do certain policies. Yeah. But he then focused a lot on this idea of the underclass. And what was really funny was it wasn't really funny, it was kind of crazy. Yeah. In the 1990s, he wrote, after writing this book, Rupert Murdoch, of all people, the owner of all the kind of right-wing press in Britain, the Times, the Sunday Times, he also had, Fox News and all of that at that time. Yeah. He flew Charles Murray over to Britain where he wrote a bunch of articles for the Sunday Times. He went and met the Institute for Economic Affairs, which is today like the hard Brexit think tank. It was the driving force of Brexit. He met with those guys, did some briefings. He met with Number 10. He met with the Treasury. He met Margaret Thatcher herself. He was like the darling of the establishment. And he inserted into British discourse this idea of the underclass, that there is this group of people in Britain who are just problematic culturally, economically, and he was very clever about it. When he went to the UK, he didn't talk so much about genetics.
Yeah.
He spoke about all of the political and economic implications of what he was saying, and that's what they swallowed. And they were like, "Wow, that's amazing. We love that."
So then you have this unholy alliance between these libertarian capitalists who want sort of neoliberal economics to dominate because they want to ensure that there are no barriers to their big corporations or funders being able to trade in the world, and these eugenicists who are providing the sort of intellectual lubrication, the intellectual justification for the stratification of society that will inherently flow from those economic choices. Is that
exactly
what you're saying? I just want to take a second to kind of remind people that these conversations about things like eugenics and the notion that there are some people who are lower IQ biologically, etc., it might sound like this is some crazy out there stuff, right? People are like, no one really believes that anymore. But I just want to draw your attention to a conversation just a few years ago in 2019 between Jordan Peterson, okay, one of the most watched and listened to pseudo-intellectuals, at least today I would use that term, and a podcaster, a white nationalist podcaster and proponent of so-called men's rights, in which Peterson defended the bell curve, right? The bell curve, which is the book that you were referencing that argues that there are just inherently some people with lower IQs biologically. And he said this, this is Peterson's own words, IQ is a particularly ugly aspect of science because the IQ literature reveals that which no one wants to face. Oh, that classic one, which is that there are profound and virtually irremediable differences in people's cognitive performances, and that those differences have a very solid biological and heritable basis. No one wants to hear that, he says. Well, yes, because it's false and racist. But, he and others are obviously going off this idea that there are truths that the liberals just don't want to hear, right? And that narrative extends beyond what he's just saying here. So can you give us a sense of how much these ideas have seeped into mainstream conversations, mainstream political ideas, mainstream policies? If someone like Jordan Peterson can say that on a public platform just a few years ago, how far has this now gone? Give us a sense.
So I think that, and this is what I think the book ends up demonstrating, I think that this ideology that's inspired by Nazi eugenics, this scientific racism, this hierarchical ideology, I think that it has become very mainstream. I think it has penetrated the heart of a wide range of major conservative institutions around the world, and that it started in the United States, this process. It was exported around the world through vehicles like the Heritage Foundation, through the Institute for Economic Affairs. Let's remember that Sir Anthony Fisher, British chicken farmer, who founded these think tanks, he made a lot of money. He was upset about Labour coming into power after the Second World War. He set up what is now known as the Atlas Network, which is, he founded the Institute of Economic Affairs as well. He was involved with people who were behind the Heritage Foundation. He helped set up the whole infrastructure of conservatism in the UK. And the Atlas Network is now just under 500 organizations in just under 100 countries all over the world. So they're all interconnected.
And what do they believe? What are they advocating?
So they're advocating these very extreme free market policies. They want total deregulation for big capital, big finance, big tech.
And what is the connection between that idea and the eugenics?
So the big connection here is that Charles Murray's ideas about the biological hierarchy in society is a brilliant underpinning if you believe in extreme deregulation, because it justifies the idea that there is no point in the state attempting to deal with inequalities in society and problems in society. All those problems, according to that ideology, are due to groups of people and their own issues to do with their biology.
Or there'd be no point to US aid, for example.
Yes,
because
for instance.
those people
absolutely.
are not in need.
So just don't spend on them anymore. Stop spending on them. It's a total waste of money. That's the ideology.
Which is now official US government policy.
Yes.
One of the first to be brought in under the Trump administration. I want to ask you about the stage of fascism that we're at, because, we're having this conversation and you're outlining the reality that today there are very powerful political parties, think tanks, intellectuals or pseudo-intellectuals who are beholden to these ideas of racial hierarchies, of the justification for the stratification of societies, and maybe even beyond that, the notion that some people just are not worthy of, of life, actually, because that's what we're talking about. US aid, the consequence of removing US aid is that some people will die because we're not providing the means for them to stay alive. What stage of fascism are we at now that Elon Musk, who is now part of the US government, gets up and repeatedly does a Nazi salute out in the open? Like, what stage is that? Because I think in the mainstream discourse, in legacy media, we're seeing it discussed almost as if it's a debate. Did he, didn't he? But also we're seeing sort of like, well, it's just a bit out there. He's just a bit out there. What analysis do you make of what we saw there?
So, I don't know whether Elon Musk himself personally is an avid Nazi. Like, no one knows. No one can know that. But what is clear is that if you look at physically what he actually did, that was a physical Nazi salute. I mean, that was what it was. So the question is, why did he do that? Did he? And I guess people are debating: was it intentional? Was it unintentional? But when you look at the context,
he did it repeatedly.
Yeah, he did it repeatedly. I think what's interesting is, if someone shows you who they are, you kind of believe them. It's okay,
As a woman, yes. Once someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time.
Yeah, exactly.
We had 3 opportunities.
Yeah. And, look at what he's been doing in the context of this story that we see developing. It's not just about that history. It's about how it's impacting in real time these powerful individuals. So we can see that there are direct points of influence on things like the Nazi Pioneer Fund and, these big tech bro people. So, people in Silicon Valley, like Elon Musk's partner, Peter Thiel. These guys partnered together. Peter Thiel is another major Silicon Valley guy. Many people don't know who he is in Britain, but he was the founder of one of the founders of PayPal.
Yes.
He was also a big investor in Facebook. Also, now he's in
Palantir.
Palantir is obviously what he's very well known for now, which is a major defense contractor and kind of big data behemoth. So Peter Thiel is another of these billionaires. He teamed up with Musk. They helped set up the America PAC, which funded the campaign to get Trump in. Now, Peter Thiel has so many points of interconnection with these groups. So one of in his biography written by Max Chafkin, who is a Bloomberg reporter, he reports that Peter Thiel actually bankrolled and gave seed funding to a magazine called Quillette, which most experts agree is basically just a clearinghouse for repackaging this scientific racism stuff. They've tried to elevate Charles Murray and his ideas, and they've elevated other kind of eugenics ideas. And there's so many other points of it. That's just one example, right? Elon Musk, look at what he's been doing on X, right? He has been signal boosting Nazis. He has been allowing Nazis back onto the platform. He's actually had direct conversations with Nazis on his platform as well. He has endorsed weird statements which are anti-Semitic, saying, like, there was one comment by someone who said that Western Jewish populations are part of this conspiracy to bring mass immigration to destroy white people. And he was like, yes, I agree with this. So this is what he's been doing. So when you look at what he's been doing on his platform, and then you connect that with what he did at during the inauguration, why would you say that these are two different things?
So let me ask you about that in a bit more detail. So when Musk made that Nazi salute, the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, which was created to combat anti-Semitism, at least purportedly, rushed to his defense. Okay, they were out here trying to find any number of excuses for why Musk is not somehow an anti-Semite. Why would an organization like the ADL, and I pick out the ADL, but we could have selected others who came to Musk's defense. Why would the ADL, with their mandate to combat anti-Semitism, go out of its way to defend what pretty much everyone could see was a fascist salute? Why would they do that?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to understand what's going on here. I think the ADL, which has produced some interesting information about anti-Semitism, racism, and Islamophobia, they found themselves in an odd political position where they felt the need to ally themselves with Musk. That raises all sorts of questions about how the ADL has situated itself historically in relation to what's going on in Israel, what's going on with the US administration, and what function they see themselves playing. To me, it seems that they wanted to ingratiate themselves with this incoming administration, and they were willing to essentially downplay this thing in order to do that.
But this is not the only example I could point you to. So last year, after October the 7th happened, we had a big march in France against anti-Semitism. And in the front row of this march, in what I personally take to be an affront to the Jewish community, we had Marine Le Pen, the daughter of Jean-Marie Le Pen, who was an Algerian tortionary, an open anti-Semite, somebody who denies the Holocaust, and his daughter, who's taken over the mantle of the party and rehabilitated it, and we'll talk about how these parties have rehabilitated, standing hand in hand with members of the Jewish community in a march against anti-Semitism. There is no version of reality in which I believe Marine Le Pen to be a reformed racist. The statements that her party makes about minorities, about immigrants, about black and brown people on a regular basis, and particularly around Muslims, are an obvious indication that that would be a lie. So we're seeing, not just with the ADL, but in this instant and others we could think of, examples of where there seems to be this weird rapprochement between the far right and some organizations who claim to be combating anti-Semitism. What is going on with that?
So this is an interesting thing because it goes back, I think, to what was attempted right from the beginning after the Second World War, which is, we're not Nazis. So you've got these Nazis who are traditional anti-Semites in a new post-Nazi world, and they have to say, actually, we're against Nazis. And one of the things that they did was to say, well, actually, we're very pro-Israel. That was one of the first tactical shifts that they did.
But why?
So because they had to defend themselves and they wanted to say that we're not anti-Semitic. So what that did is it created this interesting dynamic, right? Where you had all of these burgeoning far-right groups. And I think if you go back to, say, 20, 30 years ago, Israel's response to those groups would have been and was, we can't work with those groups. Those people are obviously anti-Semitic. But things changed. And especially changed with Benjamin Netanyahu. So just as an example of this, in 2016, Israel's foreign ministry labeled the Austrian FPO, which is a historically actual Nazi party. Like
they have former SS members, right?
They're not like, we were founded then and now we've become, a little bit neo-Nazi. These guys actually collaborated with the Nazis in the Second World War, right? So, and they wrote, when they reformed again, and kind of revitalized, they did it on the back of these Nazi fraternities in Austria, which it was, and this is really well documented and really disturbing, right? These guys are now basically in government, they're in the coalition. And in 2016, the Israeli foreign ministry was like, those guys are extremists, they're anti-Semitic, they have this Nazi adjacent thing, we shouldn't work with them, right? Fast forward a few more years, Benjamin Netanyahu's in there. He's like, no, let's invite them over. So then they had meetings with the FPO, it's all fine, hunky-dory. So there is a tactical shift there. And again, can't read people's minds, but for the FPO, why would they do it? Obviously because they have this very clear Nazi ancestry, and they want to position themselves to say, no, we're not anti-Semitic. They want to make themselves palatable. They want to deny the reality of what they are by saying that's not what we are. So they're trying to rebrand themselves. For the right-wing extreme in Israel, represented by Netanyahu, why would they do that? Well, this is where it gets quite Machiavellian, right? Despite knowing, so the Israeli government literally has said, those people are anti-Semitic. They're partnering with those people because of an alignment geopolitically, right? That those guys are going to be pro-Israel. They're going to support what we're doing in Gaza, going to support what we're doing in Palestine, and they won't criticize us. They'll be an ally in Europe in that respect, and that works for us, even if it means that they're a threat to Jewish people in Austria.
But surely that's also aligned, because obviously Israel wants to encourage Jewish people to flee to the supposed, homeland, which of course is the occupation. And so having alliances with far-right neo-Nazi groups who are going to make life really difficult for Jewish people and other minorities also serves their purpose, surely.
Well, again, I would say there's different factions in Israel. Some people believe certain things, some people believe other things. But definitely, the extreme right wing have very weird and dubious ideas. There are some people in the extreme right wing in Israel who want to see and have spoken about the idea of things getting harder for Jews and Israel being the safe haven, and people should just leave. They should leave Europe because Europe is like this and Europe's like that. Not everyone obviously believes that. Even in the Israeli right wing, not everyone believes that.
Yeah.
So I don't want to oversimplify that.
Yeah.
But you are right that it raises this question of what exactly is, how else can you interpret Netanyahu openly allying himself with anti-Semites in Europe and saying that that's good for Jews? How can it be good for Jews unless you have this idea that actually these anti-Semites might do bad things to Jews in Europe, and that's okay? It's a very strange, and it's a moral quagmire, and it kind of sums up the whole reality of what Netanyahu's been doing.
And isn't that because part of the deal that seems to have been struck, at least from my perception, is that as long as you focus your Nazi fascist ideas and ideals on the Muslims and on the immigrants and the asylum seekers, we won't get in your way if you also clearly in the back doors, in your back rooms, continue to hold these anti-Semitic views.
I think there's absolutely a strange emerging alliance that we have seen, that in the way in which Israel has forged these relationships with not just the Austrian FPO, but a number of these groups in Europe who have these far-right fascist kind of ideologies.
Can you name some for us?
Well, even the Republican Party. Right. The Republican Party has been elevating these kind of eugenics ideas, right? And you look at the Christian Zionist ideology, which is actually believes that Israel is going to be destroyed in a massive Armageddon. What is going on? Why is it that Israel thinks that it's a good idea, and some people in Israel think that's a great idea? Let's partner with those guys.
Yeah.
So there is a quo prid quo type agenda being put in play, where it's like, let's ally with some of these groups, knowing that right now the target is going to be immigrants. It's going to be certain people of color. It's going to be Muslims, especially, and that works because if we have this idea of there's just this homogeneous threat for Muslims, whether it's within Palestine or whether it's in Europe or in other parts of the Middle East, that works very much for Israel's own geopolitical kind of interests in the region, their own the way that they've conducted the war in Gaza and all the rest of it, and that works very well for the U.S. government, the Republican agenda that they have, and the kind of authoritarian control mechanisms that they're trying to put through works very well for those far right parties who want to kind of remake world order, and they're using the specter of this massive Muslim threat as the rationale. It all fits together. Is it going to stay like that forever? I don't think so, because these guys disagree fundamentally on so many different things.
Yeah.
But there is that convergence point that is leading to this very dangerous radicalization.
The Tea is a fully independent, non-partisan production. No corporate ties here, just a small, dedicated team working hard to bring you honest, impactful conversations. If you believe in our work, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just click that subscribe button now and join us on Patreon. You'll find the link in our bio. Can you outline for us some of the ideas from these fascist groups, think tanks, ideologues that have now become normalized in how we think in the mainstream? And I mean, one of the obvious ones to me is the Great Replacement theory. So in France, the Great Replacement theory has now become completely mainstream. We hear it debated on news, primetime TV, discussion over how Muslims are, set to outnumber, the native European population. I mean, these discussions have become part and parcel of how people are now thinking about the world. I'll be talking to somebody in France, casually in a supermarket, and they will just casually land that, we have to do something about the Muslim takeover. So run us by some of the things we should be attentive to and where the roots of those ideas have actually come from.
Yeah, I mean, so the Great Replacement theory, this idea that there is some sort of plan or conspiracy, often by liberals, to bring in totalitarian Sharia Islamist Muslims.
That'd be us.
That would be us, yeah, from different parts of the world, largely Africa, the Middle East, and other places, and they're going to replace white people, and that's the plan. I mean, what's interesting about this is that this dovetails with the cultural Marxist theory, which is another one of these weird theories become really mainstream, right? So, and both of these come from these historical, again, very kind of Nazi type ideas about the threat from other populations, inferior populations, repackaged with eugenics and all the rest of it. So the cultural Marxism theory, again, was about, there's a bunch of Jewish liberals, academics, who have decided that they're going to fight this culture war against the West, and they're going to undermine Western institutions through culture. And that dovetails with this idea, right? But this totally contradictory. It doesn't even make sense. You've got this alliance of Jews, liberals, gender fluid, transgender liberals, and Islamist totalitarians who hate gay people and hate everything. And they're all working together, and they're all going to come and replace white people. And that's the plan.
That's literally what we are being sold yes. as a coherent theory. Can we just take a second to absorb the level of incoherence? And yet, it is now perceived common knowledge that in our universities, in the halls of power, at the BBC, these groups are all working together to sort of, subvert traditional values. I mean, it's a tour de force, from a PR perspective, Nafeez. How have they done this?
This has been like decades of work, right, of trying to normalize these ideas. And I think what we've not quite understood, and I think that also becomes quite clear in the book, that there is a machine that is driving this. This is not just happening by accident.
What do you mean by a machine?
So this is how it works, right? You've got these, and so I've hinted a little bit some of it, right? So you've got these big foundations. Who funds them? They're not ordinary philanthropies, right? Who funds philanthropies is people with a huge amount of money.
Okay, name names.
Mostly people like the Koch industries who are very well known, right? I mentioned the Bradley Foundation, who are. There's the Scaife Foundation, the Robert Mellon Foundation, all these different foundations. They won't mean anything to people, but what do they represent? They represent huge amounts of money based on key industries. It could be fossil fuels. I mentioned industrial automation, banking, finance, hedge funds. So these guys have made all their money. And these guys are looking at this, and they set up these foundations. They create these foundations, which then create these think tanks. They create these brands, which they make the brands sound really kind of serious, and these guys know what they're talking about. They then create these figureheads, people like Charles Murray, people like Douglas Murray in Britain, people like Jordan Peterson. They help them with their books. They then provide PR to support them. They get them onto all the channels. They train them. They even get them to do fitness training and make them look good and style them and everything. And then they put them all over the place. And in the age of social media, they'll do everything. They'll create memes around them. They will run their campaigns on Facebook, on Instagram, on X, on Snapchat, you name it, they're there. And that is what's happening. It's a machine. So along that way, different parts of that machine have been stress testing what are the ideas that are really going to land, right? So Renaud Camus, the French guy who wrote this, first time he wrote The Great Replacement Theory, he wasn't the first guy that said this.
No.
They had loads of American racists, people like Daniel Pipes,
right.
People like John Sullivan, who was at the Heritage Foundation. He was also an advisor to Margaret Thatcher. He's now in Hungary running a think tank with Viktor Orban. So these guys are writing about this stuff back then, right? There's a birth death of white people. There is all these dark-skinned brown people coming and they're going to take over. Most of them are Muslims. They were saying this stuff. But then Renaud Camus came and he said, this is the great replacement. And then people in the kind of conservative powers that be looked at that and were like, that's it, we got it. That's the language, guys. Let's take that. So they took that and they made him a king. They poured money into that. They weaponized it. Next thing you had Anders Breivik goes and literally in 2011 in Norway goes and massacres 77 people. He's a neo-Nazi terrorist. He was inspired by the Great Replacement Theory. You got the Christchurch killings in New Zealand. So these theories,
where a mosque was attacked, and the worshippers were gunned down.
Yes.
Yeah.
So this is you're talking about. This stuff has real world consequences. It's not just a joke. It's not just ideas. These are ideas that are literally tearing us apart, and they're inspiring people to take up arms against ordinary people around them. So it's a pretty frightening time, and that's the power of this machine. That's how it's getting out there.
And I think, look, we can sense it in the culture. Like, Nafeez, you and I have known each other many years. And over the course of those years, there are certain ideas that were once fringe. And I want to cite some of them. Things like the notion of there being a civilizational clash between Islam and the West. When I was at university doing my undergraduate degree, these were ideas that were being touted and viewed as fringe and out there and actually unhistorically, verifiable, that they were just sort of spin effectively. Or the notion that Muslims are incompatible with the West, that we can never truly belong here. Those were fringe ideas being pushed by racists. But now you'll hear people say to you, Islam doesn't really belong in the UK. You'll hear people say, I am concerned about the demographic threat of Muslims. People will say this in casual conversation. And you and I also know that the Brexit campaign, which obviously Nigel Farage, who leads the Reform Party here in the UK, which by the way is topping the polls currently. If there was an election tomorrow, the predictions are that they would win those elections. That party had, if you remember in its pro-Brexit campaign, a picture of Syrian refugees appearing to flood Europe, when, of course, that was they were not coming to the UK in any case, and they were just fleeing war. So to what extent would you say, and if you could point out some of these ideas, that there are things that these people have been pushing now for decades that we've all now internalized as just standard? It's just normal way to think about things. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I think so obviously the specter of immigration, right? The idea that all our problems fundamentally are because of this massive movement of people, right? And these, so obviously you can, people who look at this on its face is like, oh, the immigration. I'm not saying immigration is not something we need to think about.
Of course.
Obviously we have to think about it. There should be policies around it. But the way in which this has been couched, it suggests that there is an imminent demographic threat. And that's responsible for all our problems. If it's the NHS, if it's our energy system, if it's, you know, the economy, is jobs, it's all because of immigration. So that's a general idea, right? There are these people who are they're coming in, they're changing everything, they're taking everything down. So this is generalized fears, right? And so when people are feeling, and it's completely understandable why people are feeling deeply like terrible about all the things going on. People are living from paycheck to paycheck. Wages are not rising. Inflation is going through the roof. It's still high, despite the percentage, you know, kind of dip. It's still really bad. Cost of living crisis is ongoing. People are not experiencing any major improvements in quality of life. If not, things are getting worse. Things are getting harder. Right now, when your people are feeling that level of anxiety, you know. When someone comes in and says, well, it's just about these immigrants, you don't really know who these people are. You might not have had contact with them. You don't really know. You kind of just think, well, maybe that makes sense then. It's easy, you know, and it's very mimetic, right? It's these memes, they just land on your plate, whether it's YouTube, whether it's Instagram. You watch something weird and you'll be like, yeah, that kind of makes sense.
And there's this confluence, of course, between the attention economy, which is shrinking, right? We only have 15 seconds to understand complex issues. So here's a picture of an immigrant, that'll be the problem. And the proposition of these simplistic narratives to what actually are also not necessarily complex problems in and of themselves, because we're talking about inequality driven by essentially hoarders. You know, I think instead of calling them billionaires, we probably should just say hoarders, right?
Yes.
These are people who hoard money on a huge scale. And in so doing, they deprive the majority of people, you know, of a fair wage, of, you know, access to basic services that all humans require. And you're saying that these ideologies provide the sort of pseudo-scientific justification for why the world is the way it is, why Gazans deserve to die, why poor people and handicapped people should just be abandoned. Why would we spend money on looking after these people? And I think probably the same with the elderly, actually, to some extent. It'd be interesting how that develops in that sector.
Well, look at what's just happened here in the UK, right? Elon Musk has come in, and one of the first things he does is he targets UK, and he says that he literally says that there is a mass rape crisis to do with Muslims specifically. Right. And he weaponizes the grooming gangs crisis, which was obviously a horrifying scandal.
Horrific
which we
scandal.
all have to condemn.
Yeah.
More has to be done. But what was he doing? He weaponized it. This is a guy with massive sexual assault allegations against him, like in Tesla. Which are not being dealt with. You know, there's some evidence that he's, you know, there's settlements going on behind the scenes, all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But no, he's the hero,
yes.
And he's kind of white and knight in shining armor coming in, and total propaganda.
Yeah.
So GB News, he was amplifying propaganda from GB News, which is part of this network, by the way.
Yeah, so GB News is one of the new networks that have propped up here in the UK and have now almost overtaken some of the former legacy media channels in providing audiences with these simplistic narratives around where we're at. And GB News, tell us a bit about the kind of the background and where it fits into all of this.
So GB News, its main owner and funder is a guy called Christopher Chandler. And I did a story about this at Byline, where we exposed his very interesting history, having made most of his fortune saving Gazprom, which is Russia's state-owned oil and gas company, back in the day, a couple of decades ago now. So he saved Gazprom from crisis. He worked with Vladimir Putin's closest confidants in doing that, made loads of money, and then, you know, decided that he's going to very generously support GB News and make a loss.
So, right. And so we have to be honest about media networks that are making a loss. If you are funding a media network that is making a loss, you are involved in propaganda. I mean, because otherwise it's a commercial enterprise or it's a public service. There are only three options here. You're involved in public service, you're a commercial enterprise out to make money, or you're involved in propaganda, where you are essentially making a loss and accepting that. I interrupted you on your point about Musk, but I do want you to continue on what you were saying.
So what's interesting, so GB News is obviously, if people are watching it, you can see that they've been pushing these kinds of ideas for a while, including great replacement theory ideas, very anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant stuff, pumping it out. And one of the things that they've been putting out is this grooming gang stuff. So this guy, Charlie Peters, he basically calls himself a journalist and says that he's investigating all of this stuff. He put out a disinformation thread on X, which Elon Musk amplified. I think it got something like 24 million views. And one of the core things that he claimed in that is he referred to this study. And he said that, look at all the statistics, but this study shows how disproportionately involved Muslims are in grooming gangs. And so what I did is I actually looked into that study. And not only was the study, I mean, he ended up saying that 1 in 73 Muslims in Rotherham, for instance, are done. And he all caps 1 in 73. So you can see what he's doing here. He's clearly trying to demonize Muslims and suggest that there's some overwhelming propensity to be involved in this kind of horrific crime.
Yeah.
So I looked at the research, and obviously there was something odd about it because it doesn't make sense. Like the actual data shows overall with child sexual abuse that actually, I mean, and this is, anyone can look this up, and even Sky News have been reporting it, other people, but the data shows that there's no actual evidence of any particular group being disproportionately represented in anything. It's most of the perpetrators are white. That's not necessarily meaning anything because most people in Britain are white.
Right.
So we don't need to make anything out of that.
Yeah.
And only 29% at the moment of cases have ethnicity being recorded. So there's poor data. And the Home Office did a 2-year study and they said, look, we can't make conclusions about it.
Yeah.
Well, he finds this obscure study. The study was not published in a peer-reviewed journal.
Yeah.
It was
so peer-reviewed, for people who don't know what that means your fellow academics look at your methodology and confirm that you have used a sort of scientifically recognized means of coming to your conclusions.
That's right. It's basically, it goes through this process of review by multiple experts who look at what you've done and they say, actually, let's...
Fair dues, this is an argument, you can hold it.
And if they think there's weaknesses, they feed back and you kind of tighten it up.
Yeah.
So it didn't go through that process at all.
Yeah.
Then I looked at the actual paper itself in detail. And to sum it up, the paper itself admits that the data that it uses doesn't really mean anything because they say all of the data it's based on was not based on actual court data and prosecutions. It was based on media reports of prosecution. So then they make this analysis and then they say, well, to be fair, we acknowledge that because our data is entirely from media reports, it's quite possible that we have ignored cases which involve white perpetrators, which have not been covered in the media.
Yeah.
And that could mean that we are severely underestimating the number of white perpetrators. And it could also mean that there are other cases which are overrepresenting in another direction. But basically, because we don't know what the biases are, it's completely unknown, so we don't really know. So then it was like, okay, if you don't know what the biases are, your data and your conclusions are literally meaningless because you don't know whether it's true or not. So that study that was circulating, despite that, it's turned into a meme. So, you've got the little ratio, the 1 in 73, Muslims are doing this. That's been plastered everywhere. It's been amplified by many people, including academics like Matthew Goodwin, other people who've been putting it out. So it gives it this semblance of believability.
Yeah.
So now you've got ordinary folks coming across this stuff and thinking, well, that's terrible. Here we have proof. Well, Muslims are overrepresented in this. This is a real threat. It's a real problem. There's something wrong with this, with Muslims.
Yeah.
And that becomes a generalized thing, even though it's total nonsense.
Yeah.
It's not based on anything.
Yeah. And of course, that's a narrative around Muslims being, allegedly more violent, more prone to sexual violence, that we find, again, repeated in other circumstances. So it's, for example, the narrative that helped justify the notion that the assault that Israel has committed against Gaza was justified because they were out here committing rape, even though the public prosecutor in Israel themselves have not identified cases that they're pursuing of sexual violence in that setting. So we then have these narratives about Muslims being these evil, dangerous, sexually, crazed barbarians that seep into the analysis of every single instance in which it serves us to demonize the quote unquote other. I was wondering how much you'd noticed some of those ideas seeping into the way in which Gaza and what Israel's been doing to Gaza has been represented in the media.
So I think we're all experiencing, this concerted dehumanization process from watching what's been going on in Gaza. It's incessant. Like everyone I know feels traumatized. And in fact, it doesn't matter whether you're Jewish or Muslim or whatever you are.
Right.
Just the stuff that is coming out is so traumatic. But one of the consistent themes of it that is so disturbing, it's become normal to see people who look Muslim be completely obliterated on your screens every day. It's just normal. It's just what's happening. That's just happening.
That's just how it is.
Yeah. The photos of Gaza looking like a total apocalypse is like, well, it's just a war, isn't it? That's just war.
And that's in fact one of the arguments they use. I've heard, public pundits say it, well, this is what it is. It's war.
It's astonishing. And I think, seeing this on our phones and our TVs day in and day out has I think it's degrading our collective consciousness, like our ability to make moral judgments about the disgusting abnormality of this scale of violence. It's totally different. Like if you go back to Iraq, like we will remember the Iraq war, right, and the way it was then. We didn't see it. It wasn't in our faces in that way, right?
There were things that leaked and horrified the world, but we did not see day in, day out for 16 months pictures of
real time,
absolute horrific.
And I think that's what's so different and weird about what's happening. It's that we're seeing it every day. It's in our faces, and it's brazen. And I think that's what really worries me about that is it's almost like it feels like it's normal. If it's normal to exterminate a population in that way and to just completely obliterate them and to destroy where they live and all of that stuff, what is the implications for us here? What does that mean?
Or for other, groups around the world who are deemed to be not worthy of life or clothing or shelter or medical assistance or humanitarian law or whatever else. I want to ask you about this connection between the conservative libertarian ideals of these techno bros and these fascistic Nazi groups, think tanks, individuals, because I was at a festival, not Burning Man, where I was listening to a leading tech bro speaking with a government official about regulation of the tech industry. What struck me most in the conversation was that this individual, who I won't name, was so brazenly arrogant in the conversation that he was almost laughing at the idea that this government official representing the UK government's body for specifically regulating the tech industry, he was mocking them and sort of saying, listen, we know who, in this case, it's definitely the tail wagging the dog, aka the tech industry is guiding everything you do. You people are always, 10 years behind us. We teach you how to use the tech. Okay. So the idea that you're going to regulate us, please. And in a private conversation, he shared that he and a group of people that he was with, they're working towards an alternative system outside of government regulation. So tell us a bit about the sort of libertarian ideals of these techno bros and where they align with people like Musk and now Trump.
So one of the things that's obviously clear is that, you've got the European Union, you got Britain. Even in America, there were legislative moves to start regulating tech a lot more, and this was obviously linked to things that have happened. Even the riots last year, Britain and in Europe, people were like, "What the hell has just happened?" I mean, Elon Musk signal boosting these fascists, people coming out in the streets. We can't allow this to keep going on. This is nuts.
Yeah.
So there's been this legislation, right? It's primarily now, after America has now been taken over by the Trump faction. It's Britain and Europe, which are now leading that regulatory charge, right?
Yeah.
Ironically, those are the places where now, Musk and all of his buddies are looking and saying, we need to really sort those guys out. We need to do something about those guys. So that's not an accident. They don't want to be regulated in that way. But that desire for no regulation is rooted in some of these same ideas. And where you get this weird overlap, it starts with this really strange ideology called long-termism, which is this very techno-utopian ideology. And one of the key guys behind it is a fellow called Nick Bostrom, who used to be at Oxford University. His Future of Humanity Institute was funded by Elon Musk.
Okay.
Elon Musk read loads of his books and blurbed them and loves his stuff. So Nick Bostrom, he wrote the founding kind of charter of what long-termism is. And it's kind of eugenics. It refers to eugenics kind of openly. It talks about this idea of different populations. Even Nick Bostrom himself wrote a paper about these, the idea that in the future, we're going to have this technology to choose, to make decisions about cognitive enhancement and stuff at birth. And if we think that the babies are not going to be clever enough, we can stop that in utero.
Yeah.
So he was advocating these soft eugenics ideas. I mean, they're pretty hard eugenics from my point of view. It then emerged a couple of years later, or very recently, that he actually bought into the kind of Charles Murray bell curve worldview, because he actually sent an email on a listserv and it was leaked, where he referred very directly to the idea that black people are stupider than white people. So he actually buys these ideas hook, line, and sinker.
So this is evidence that in the public domain, what you've just said, this email of him referring to...
Yes. And I've described in the book. It's all of this is really well documented. So he's kind of having these ideas. So long-termism kind of built on this idea, right? And it basically says that in the future, the future evolution of humans is going to be driven with AI and machines, and at some point or other, humans are going to merge with machines, and we're going to upload our minds into the cloud. And once we upload our minds into the cloud, we're going to be having these kind of digital playgrounds. And eventually we're going to become a multiplanetary species. We're going to go into space and we're going to colonize all these planets. But there's going to be so many of us that we're going to need planet-sized servers and computers, which are powering all of this. And there'll be trillions of humans, digital humans, living happily in their virtual reality paradises. And we're going to expand across the universe. And this is the future. It's going to happen. This is what's going to happen. But there might be catastrophic risks that derail that. Meteor strike, maybe climate change. We're not that worried about climate change. We're more worried about unproductive poor people. So, for instance, one of these long-termists, like his name's William McCaskill, he wrote about how where should we do what is effective altruism, right? What is the best way to donate money? So effective altruism is another movement linked to the long-termists, right? Which we're going to be really effective in our selflessness. So how do we do this? So ironically, they do this deep philosophical analysis, and they're like, well, you know what? If we give money to poor people in Africa, that's not going to really help people, because all that's going to do is stop those poor Africans from being poor for like 5 minutes.
Yeah.
So what we really should do is give more money to rich, productive white people who are producing all these amazing technologies, and they're the frontier, and they're going to push humanity forward, because that's really good for everybody. So actually effective altruism means give more money to white people and more money to tech bros. And don't worry about poor
Anybody
people
else.
And black people and brown people.
This is trickle-down economics. This is classic trickle-down economics, surely, right? It's just invest at the top and like people at the bottom will benefit. I mean, shame on them for not working harder. They should just work their way out of the slums, and then they could also succeed.
Isn't it weird how it all kind of makes sense, right? Exactly. Like, you've got this bizarre techno-utopian ideology mingling with trickle-down economics, mingling with this welfare state stuff, mingling with eugenics, but they all kind of fit together like a bit of a jigsaw.
Yeah.
And you can come at it with the part that you like the most.
Yeah.
So if maybe you might not like that part, but you'll go with the welfare state stuff and the fact that we shouldn't have one.
Yeah.
And then you might see those kind of crazy long-termist guys, and you might say, well, at least they're helping me and they're putting money into my campaign.
Yeah.
I don't know if I believe everything they're saying. But that underlying ideology, this is where it gets really terrifying, is because they believe that progressive causes, diversity, equity, inclusion, anything to do with giving money towards so-called unproductive inferior people is terrible and is a catastrophic risk. They think that you can pretty much just do anything to ensure that those things don't happen.
Yeah.
And they see democracy, which is the vehicle of those things, as a real threat. So they want to dismantle democracy. And this is not just a speculative thing. This is not a theory. You just have to go and read what they're saying. One of the biggest proponents of this is a guy called Curtis Yarvin. Curtis Yarvin is another tech bro, funded by Peter Thiel. He's in Silicon Valley, and he's kind of come up with this theory called the Dark Enlightenment. That was his whole thing, right? He says a lot of different weird things, but one of the things that is most significant, I think, to bring up today, is he came up with this idea that we should create. Democracy is a problem for all of these reasons that we described. So what do we replace it with? We should replace it with a patchwork of mini sovereignties. And these mini sovereignties are to be controlled by kind of these individual, so-called sovereign individuals who are basically tech bros, right, with tons of money. And these mini sovereignties will run without any concern for the opinion of residents who live there. They're going to be run entirely by the person who owns that territory. So they want to smash democracies into this patchwork of these mini sovereign territories, which are run by these massive, this new technological oligarchy. These huge billionaire behemoths.
All hail King Musk.
And that's why there's this weird interest in taking over Greenland, because Peter Thiel has talked about this idea of going into Greenland and setting up a weird Silicon Valley like crypto city, right? And that's the beginning of this kind of structure that they want to start creating and seeding all over the world. So that's one of the visions that we've got. Whereas this very deliberate vision of we need to take down and dismantle democracies and replace them with this new techno-authoritarian structure.
Nafeez, it's difficult to hold on to any optimism when we are hearing just how deep we are in, the confluence of interest between really nefarious actors. A recent study here in the UK found that today a majority of Gen Zs, more than half, want a dictatorship. With everything you've studied, with everything you know, what are some of the essential parts of the fight back, of the pushback? What do people need to know? What do they need to understand? And what should we all be doing to push back against this authoritarian, fascist takeover, or the Alt-Reich, as you put it?
So I think the first thing is to remember that things are going to get worse, right? That things are going to get crazy in the next few years.
Worse?
Things are going to get nuts. But what we need to remember is that what these people want to do cannot work. It can't work. It's not based on reality. And not just in the long term, even in the short term, it's not going to work. And we already saw this, right? Trump came in 2016, tried to do all his stuff, and then reality happened. Pandemic happened, other stuff happened, and people got fed up and they got rid of him. Right now, obviously, they are trying to get to a point where they can make structures more authoritarian. But if you look at all the things they want to do, they want to deport 20 million migrants, they want to take out $2 trillion from the federal budget. They're literally dismantling fundamental infrastructure of American government, which runs the country. Just the conventional calculations were like that's 7.5% of GDP from just throwing out undocumented migrants. That's colossal. That's like a sucker punch to the economy.
Yes.
When I looked at, you take the whole plan in together and look at
with
the systemic
tariffs and stuff as well.
Everything that they're doing. It's like 25% of GDP is just going to just disappear. So you're going to destroy the American economy. I don't think Americans are going to sit there and just be like, yeah, that's fine. Especially.
Well, as long as they can identify who the enemy is.
Well, I think they're going to realize at that point that this is something that Trump and Musk are doing. Like they're the ones actually dismantling everything. There's only so far you can go before people are like, yeah, I might hate the migrants, and I might hate all of them lot, but this is crazy.
Yeah,
you're destroying my actual life. Reality is that when these guys come in, they do not understand the economy. They don't understand how to do politics.
Yeah.
They're going to destroy everything. So they are going to tear things down. They're going to go to town. But what it means is that they can't win ultimately. They can't actually succeed. What we need to do is, I think, in that context, is two things. One, we need to be ready to be able to explain to people the reality of what is going on. Because right now, people don't get it. People are confused. People are so disoriented by, and that's part of the plan. Part of the plan is just disorient people, just go crazy. It's like the madman theory that Richard Nixon implemented. Just act insane, and people are like, people can't respond in time,
and there are no facts anymore anyway. So
yeah, exactly. So and people don't know what to believe. So what we need to do is kind of educate ourselves and be able to empower people with understanding, first of all, what is going on. What are these people really about? What are they really trying to do? And we really need to up our game there. We need to just get rid of this liberal wishy-washy rubbish about maybe the far right is like this and is fringe. No. This is serious. That's why the subtitle of the book is A Network War, to destroy the West from within. There is a war underway, and we need to kind of wake up and be like, that's what's happening, guys. We need to fight for democracy. So that's the one. So one part of it is understanding the reality and really getting that out there so people can see it. The second thing is we need to be ready to just drop the liberal wishy-washy, let's tinker along with the current system and kind of keep it going. You know, the way in which Biden-Harris ran the campaign, the way in which Keir Starmer is currently doing things, this is also not going to work. And that's part of the problem. We're in this weird era of swing politics where voters are looking at the liberal incumbents and they're just saying, this is totally boring and uninspiring, if not semi-genocidal or full genocidal, and I can't buy into this. And then so they think, well, he's saying let's tear everything down. I'm all for tearing everything down.
Right.
So and then you tear everything down. It's like, well, that was terrible. Let me go back to the liberals who are slightly more sane, and that's obviously not palatable. So what we need to do is we need to accept that we need systemic transformation. We need radical systemic change. And we're going to have to do that one way or another. Like it depends when, and we need to get there now. So we need to focus on creating and elevating and amplifying the kind of the real visions for the future and where we could be. And these are not pie in the sky thing. What we need to be doing is ensuring that we don't save dying industries, but save people. So move and retrain workers to move into these booming emerging sectors which are going to take over. Don't be mired in this backwards thinking. Like the Reform is coming in with their climate denialism. I mean, Nigel Farage turned up at the Heartland Institute launch in the UK. The Heartland Institute is another one of these mad right-wing climate science denial organizations, lobby groups, funded by the same nexus of foundations we talked about before. And that's what he is. So this is catastrophic. So let's not vote Farage in. You know, let's try and avoid that. And let's kind of really empower these inspiring visions of what is possible and get people behind that, because there is a possible optimistic future there waiting for us, and it's coming our way inexorably. What we need to do is latch onto it and empower it.
Wonderful. Dr. Nafeez Ahmed, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us today. Thank you for tuning in. We hope you found today's conversation insightful. At The Tea, we're committed to bringing you meaningful discussions that often go unheard. If you believe in independent content, we'd love your support. Subscribe by clicking that subscribe button now. Join us on Patreon and help us keep these conversations alive. Until next time, stay informed, think critically, and we'll see you soon for more tea.